today's haul is, to my mind, though I'm grateful for the participants, inevitable, given what it is that we've been going through. We are in the heat of an election season that many people are saying is the most consequential election in our lifetime, no matter how old that person is saying it, whether it's someone my age or someone 85 or someone 25. It is a consequential election, and it has a lot to do with what we've been through over the last 4 years, especially what we've been through over the last 9 months. But if you can just imagine in the last few weeks what's happened, it's virtually consumed the airwaves, as you know, and the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the subsequent nomination by President Trump of Amy Coney Barrett, that announcement ceremony in the Rose Garden, which I watched live, and many of you did too, which has now become incredibly controversial. The release of information about President Trump's taxes, that presidential debate last week between President Trump and Joe Biden, that Trump was then diagnosed with COVID, that 34 White House staff members have now been diagnosed with COVID, the vice presidential debate last night, which is fresh in our minds, and the presidential debate next week, the second of three, which will be a town hall format, and apparently President Trump has indicated that he's game to do that. So we'll be paying attention to that. I note all that simply to say that there's a lot going on, and for somebody who's been around presidential elections for a while now, I can tell you it's very different from what we've experienced in the past. What's especially different about this election is that for the first time in my lifetime, there's some question about how people will vote and who will vote. The question of who will vote has always been around because there have been certain places, certain states, primarily in the South, where people have been discriminated against in terms of their voting rights and their ability to indeed indicate their preferences. That's always been the case. We've always worked on that. There's been legislation and obviously court decisions that have supported the right of everybody to vote in an election like this. But in this particular election where COVID is preventing people from going to the traditional polling place, and mail-in voting, for example, is an option or should be an option where absentee voting will be greater. There's a lot of controversy about this. Already, President Trump and last night, Vice President Pence have indicated that they're not sure that they will accept the results of whatever the vote is. I've never heard that from a president or vice president in my lifetime. There's always been a responsible passing on of power from one administration to the other. There hasn't been a question about voting in the same way that there is this year. As you'll hear from my young colleagues as they talk about the various elements having to do with voting, there have been controversial situations in the past, and you'll hear a little bit more about that. Let me leave it at that. You'll be much smarter, and you'll have many more questions to think about at the end of the presentation today. As you know, after these boys make their various presentations, there'll be an opportunity for us to go into breakout rooms, and then all of us can have a good discussion about what we've heard. I'm especially grateful to Ben Crawford and to Robert Balson, to Frankie Lonergan and Willem Santry, and to Will Cote for their willingness to be with us today, to have researched the topics that they've researched, to Mr. Thompson, who teaches that AP Politics and Government class, and what I think is going to be a really edifying hall today. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Take it away. Mrs. Berg.
Thank you, Mr. Brennan. First, we're going to hear from Ben Crawford.
The date is November 4th. Donald Trump has declared victory in the 2020 presidential election, despite there still being tens of thousands of mail-in ballots to be counted. The president is calling any mail-in ballots not yet counted fraudulent and unconstitutional. The country is more divided than ever before and is on the brink of a constitutional crisis. This is one possible outcome of the upcoming presidential election. If you are a U.S. citizen or are currently residing in the United States, then this speech pertains to you. The United States is coming up on one of the most contentious elections in history, and not just because the candidates support very different policies. In order to address why this election is so unique, I'm going to explain the details of how a presidential election works in the United States. The election process started all the way back in February, when states started holding primaries and caucuses. Primaries and caucuses are the two ways that political parties, like the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, select who will be their presidential candidate. This year, the two major presidential candidates are Joe Biden, the Democrat, and Donald Trump, the Republican. On November 3rd, or earlier through mail-in ballots, people all across the country will indicate their preference for either Biden, Trump, or a third-party candidate. But regardless of what the ballot says, voters are not actually choosing a presidential candidate. Let me explain. In the United States, it's not the people who choose the president, but the Electoral College, which is a body of 538 state-selected electors. In November, we will have a projected winner, but the Electoral College votes will be cast and counted in December. When citizens vote for a presidential candidate, they are actually voting for a slate of electors who are selected in each state under the laws of that state. The general expectation is that electors, in the end, will vote for the candidate to whom they were pledged, but it doesn't always turn out that way. Each state is allotted a certain number of electors based on the size of that state's delegation to Congress, which consists of 2 senators per state, plus however many members of the House of Representatives a state has, based on population. Massachusetts currently has 11 electoral votes, California has 55, Rhode Island has 4, and so on. By December 8th, a month after the election, states must have selected their electors. If they haven't, it falls to Congress to decide who that state's electors will be. On December 14th, the electors officially cast their votes, and whichever candidate obtains a majority of the electors' votes, at least 270, wins the election. In a normal election, these 2 December dates are not all that important. But this year, a year when controversy is particularly likely to arise, these dates may become critical. So, it's November 3rd. You now know that voters won't be choosing a president, but will instead be voting for a group of electors to represent them in the Electoral College. But who are the voters? Can anybody vote? The easy answer is that any US citizen who is at least 18 years old can vote in Massachusetts. But it's not that simple. In order to contextualize today's voting laws, let's take a look at history. At the founding of our country, only white male property owners could vote. In 1868, Black men were given the right to vote. And in 1870, it became illegal to prevent a citizen from voting on the basis of race. However, voting regulation remained in the hands of the states, and so-called Jim Crow laws were passed in order to prevent African Americans from voting. These laws included poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Intimidation and violence were also used to suppress the Black vote. It took almost 100 years for these laws to be made illegal by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In addition to banning poll taxes and literacy tests, the Voting Rights Act increased federal supervision over state elections to help ensure that voting laws were being followed and enforced. Furthermore, women could not vote until the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920. Only in 1952 were all people of Asian ancestry allowed to become citizens and vote, and election ballots existed only in English until 1975. So, why am I telling you this? It's all ancient history, right? Unfortunately, it's not. The Voting Rights Act was initially set to expire within a period of 5 years. The good news is that, over time, Congress has expanded and extended the act, and as such, it is still in effect today. The bad news is that there is one notable exception. A 2013 Supreme Court ruling, Shelby County v. Holder, effectively nullified one key provision of the act, which required certain states to receive federal approval before making changes to their voting laws. This change has significantly weakened the federal government's ability to prevent voter suppression. Here are just 2 ways that of-age Americans are disenfranchised today. First, requirements in some states to present a photo ID before voting prevent an estimated 21 million US citizens from voting. the cost and travel requirements for obtaining such an ID make it especially difficult for low-income and disabled Americans to attain one. Second, in some states, disenfranchisement remains legal as punishment for a crime. As a result, 6.1 million citizens have lost the right to vote. Many of these individuals were disenfranchised for offenses that have since been decriminalized, like possession of marijuana. Due to racial bias in the criminal justice system, these laws disproportionately affect Black Americans. Now that you understand the intricacies of our presidential election system and the history of voting rights in our country, Frankie's going to explain some specific impediments to voting in 2020.
Thank you, Ben. Let's hear it, Frankie.
Thank you, Ben. Voting in 2020 has seen its fair share of roadblocks and hiccups. Many, but not all, of these impediments to voting can be attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic that has disrupted our day-to-day routines. Whether it be long lines, a reduced number of polling stations, or changes to local infrastructure that affect in-person voters on Election Day, voting is not as simple for everybody as it might seem to the average voter in Massachusetts. This past primary season was marred by COVID-19's grip on our society. In Wisconsin, statewide elections were heavily impacted by long lines and closed polling locations, thanks in large part to the pandemic. The city of Milwaukee experienced a shortage of thousands of poll workers, forcing the city government to reduce the number of available polling places from the usual 180 down to just 5. Now think about that. It's Election Day, and where do you go to vote? Perhaps you've always gone to your local library to vote on Election Day. But this year, you show up at your local library and it's closed. Do you know where to go to vote? How will you get there? Will you have to take public transportation? If you have a car and this is a major city, will you be able to park anywhere near your polling station? And when you get there, how long will you have to wait in line? And if you make a mistake and wait in line for hours, only to be told that you've been waiting in the wrong line and that your polling place is elsewhere, what now? Some Milwaukee residents reportedly waited up to 2 hours just to cast their ballots. Wisconsin's Democratic governor, Tony Evers, enacted an executive order that would have delayed voting from April until June in an effort to partially rectify some of the issues surrounding voting. Wisconsin's Republican-led Supreme Court, however, overturned the order, claiming it was a, quote, constitutional overreach. This decision, coupled with the U.S. Supreme Court's order to halt an extension on absentee voting, meant that a much higher percentage of voters were forced to endure these harsh, often dangerous conditions, given the virus, just to cast their ballots. Major closures of public places, specifically libraries, made it more difficult to request absentee ballots for those who did not have internet access in their homes. The organization, Black Leaders Organizing for Communities, or BLOC, argued that Black voters, because of systemic oppression historically, are less likely to own a car, to get themselves safely to the polls and avoid public transportation, or have internet in their homes to assist them in requesting absentee ballots. This, coupled with the fact that Black neighborhoods in Milwaukee were hit particularly hard by COVID, meant that many Black voters had no choice but to relinquish their right to vote in this election rather than getting sick. Similarly, Georgia and Pennsylvania experienced significant difficulties regarding their primary elections. Georgia suffered from a similar problem as Wisconsin, as long lines caused by closed polling locations made for extremely long waits. In Pennsylvania, 1.4 million absentee ballots were cast, which was a far cry from the 84,000 cast just 4 years ago. Logistically speaking, elections are severely underfunded. Ben Hovland, chairman of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, which is the agency responsible for allocating funds for both state and federal elections, says that election officials have been tasked with what is essentially 2 elections, one absentee and one in person, but they've only been given enough money for one of them. He suggested that nonprofit organizations and even private companies could partner with election officials this upcoming November, saying, quote, "This is an all-hands-on-deck moment for our democracy. We need election officials to do their job, but citizens that can help out will go a long way to making this as successful as possible," end quote. Just recently in the state of Texas, Governor Greg Abbott issued an executive order that limited the amount of absentee ballot drop-off boxes to just one per county. This seems to us in Massachusetts to make voting a Herculean task. Now imagine being a voter in Brewster County, Texas, which has a larger landmass than Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Delaware. Many have seen this as a blatant attempt to disenfranchise Texas voters, especially in areas that would potentially lean toward the Democratic candidate Joe Biden. To quote The Guardian, long populous counties such as Travis and Harris County will be disproportionately affected by this order. These counties include Texas's most diverse cities, Houston and Austin, respectively. 9% of Travis County's population are Black and 33% are Hispanic. In Harris County, 20% of the population are Black and 43% Hispanic, end quote. Travis County voted 68% Democratic in the 2016 election, and Harris County voted 52% Democratic. It is most definitely worth noting that Abbott credited increased voter turnout in presidential years as the reason Harris County voted blue in 2016, saying, quote, "Remember in both 08 and 12, there were sweeps in Harris County, and then during the gubernatorial election, we won them back." And so this was really just kind of an echo of what happened the last few presidential cycles and a little more than that, end quote. While the Abbott administration argues that this is all an attempt to make voting safer in the age of COVID-19, it's hard to exactly follow how this executive order helps anybody other than Donald Trump. There's another factor that could prove significant in this election. On June 15, 2020, Donald Trump appointee Louis DeJoy assumed his position as head of the United States Postal Service. DeJoy comes from the private sector, having owned a North Carolina-based trucking business called New Breed Logistics, which he sold in 2014 for a whopping $615 million. A longtime Republican megadonor, DeJoy has provided Trump with $1.2 million since 2016 and $1.4 million to various Republican efforts. His detractors claim that he's completely unqualified to lead an enormous endeavor such as the post office, especially seeing as his experience in the private sector prioritized profits, in contrast with the post office, which values reliability over everything else. His supporters, however, including President Trump, cite his experience with New Breed Logistics as proof that he can help the post office, which according to the president has been hemorrhaging money for years. DeJoy cites the post office's financial instability as the reason behind his recent policy and workplace changes. Over the past few months, DeJoy has eliminated employee overtime, removed mail sorting machines from numerous postal facilities, and altered leadership positions across the board. His actions have undoubtedly hampered the effectiveness of the U.S. Postal Service, which, ahead of an election that will depend heavily on mail-in voting, has been predictably controversial. Democrats contend that his actions are attempts to hamper voting efforts, whereas DeJoy argues he's simply trying to make the post office economically viable. Just recently, a federal judge in Washington state issued an injunction that prevented DeJoy from making further changes ahead of the election, but did not require that he amend or undo the changes that he's made since taking his position in June. Whether these changes will have an adverse effect on voters' ability to make their voices heard is yet to be seen, but for the first time in many of our lifetimes, it's seeming more and more likely that we will see an election that isn't decided on Election Day. This election is, however, shaping up to be the most hotly contested in recent memory. On September 27th, the Washington Post reported that Joe Biden holds a 53 to 43% lead over President Trump in a major poll of registered voters. However, it's going to take major efforts from state and local governments to avoid repeats of the issues experienced in the state primary elections. Now, if you guys will humor me for a second, I have a screen share I would like to show you. This on the left is Harris County, Texas. It's 1,777 square miles, and that is its one polling location. This is the state of Rhode Island, which is 1,212 square miles and has 39 polling locations. This is that same county, Harris County, before and after ballot box consolidation. This line from the northwest tip of Harris County to the polling location is a 47-mile drive through Houston, no less, which is undoubtedly extremely trafficky. Thank you, guys.
Frankie, thank you so much for that. We're going to hear now from Robert.
Thank you, Ms. Berg. The 2000 presidential election between Republican nominee George Bush and Democratic nominee Al Gore goes down as one of the most controversial elections of all time. It was one of the closest elections ever, and on election night, it was unclear who had won, with the electoral votes of Florida still undecided. Just before the polls closed, all major television networks called Florida for Gore, but this was based mainly on exit polls. As the actual vote tally began, however, Bush took a substantial lead, and the networks retracted their previous statements. With 85% of the vote counted, Bush had a 100,000 vote lead, and the networks declared that Bush had won Florida, and as a result, the election. Gore privately conceded the election to Bush, and as the final votes came in, Bush's lead narrowed to under 600 votes, and Gore withdrew his concession. Florida state law required a statewide machine recount, which was completed on November 10th, 3 days after the election. After the recount, Bush had a lead of 327 votes in a state in which more than 6 million were cast. What followed was more calls for recounts in a controversial Supreme Court decision that ultimately decided the winner. Gore began calling for hand recounts as the ballots used became a point of contention. The butterfly ballot that was used was found to be visually confusing and was blamed for some Gore votes going to third-party candidate Pat Buchanan. Also, some ballots failed to be fully punched through. These ballots were called hanging chads, and there was controversy about what ballots should be counted as a valid vote. Still other ballots had no corners detached next to any presidential candidate, but there was sign of intent to vote for one candidate. These were called pregnant chads. Together, these types of ballots made up undervotes, ballots not counted because voter intent was not clearly marked on the ballots, which became the center of the recount controversy. The Florida Supreme Court ruled that all undervotes be counted in all counties, but the Bush team appealed and the case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ordered the recount to halt so they could hear arguments on the case and make an official ruling before the recount was complete. The Supreme Court was under time pressure because under federal law, known as the Safe Harbor provision, a state must choose its electors 6 days before the Electoral College meets in person. In 2000, that deadline was December 12th, and the court heard arguments on December 11th. The first part of the court's decision was a 7-2 ruling in which the majority sided with Bush, stating that his rights under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment had been violated, as there was no legal existing standard to recount punch card ballots. Stevens and the late Justice Ginsburg dissented, arguing that for reasons of upholding state power in our federal system, the Florida Supreme Court's decision had to be respected, and that they were fundamentally right because each vote had to be counted. The second part of the decision was a 5-4 ruling along partisan lines, with Souter and Breyer siding with Stevens and Ginsburg. The majority opinion argued that no constitutional recount could be made in the time remaining before the safe harbor deadline. Breyer and Souter, who had sided with the majority in the first decision, dissented, both arguing that a constitutional recount could be fashioned in time, and that time is of the least importance when constitutional rights are at stake. Ultimately, this decision stopped the recount process, with Bush officially in the lead, giving him Florida's electors and the election. Now I'd like to share a brief clip of Gore's concession speech, which he made on December 13th of 2000, 2 days after the Supreme Court decision.
Almost a century and a half ago, Senator Stephen Douglas told Abraham Lincoln, who had just defeated him for the presidency, "Partisan feeling must yield to patriotism. I'm with you, Mr. President, and God bless you. Well, in that same spirit, I say to President-elect Bush that what remains of partisan rancor must now be put aside, and may God bless his stewardship of this country. Neither he nor I anticipated this long and difficult road. Certainly neither of us wanted it to happen. Yet it came, and now it has ended, resolved as it must be resolved through the honored institutions of our democracy. Over the library of one of our great law schools is inscribed the motto, "Not under man, but under God and law." That's the ruling principle of American freedom, the source of our democratic liberties. I've tried to make it my guide throughout this contest, as it has guided America's deliberations of all the complex issues of the past 5 weeks. Now the U.S. Supreme Court has spoken. Let there be no doubt, while I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. We're going to hear now from Will.
The outcome of the 2020 election holds a lot of uncertainties right now. With the COVID-19 pandemic, there are many possible scenarios for what could happen with the election. Let's take a look at a few of them. The first possible outcome would be a decisive Biden victory or a decisive Trump victory. If the election were tomorrow, a decisive Biden victory is currently very realistic based on poll results. According to models by The Economist, Biden is predicted to win the Electoral College with about 341 electoral votes, which is 71 over the required 270 vote threshold to win the presidency. This prediction holds true with many other predictions made so far, so this is a realistic scenario we could see on election night. Another realistic scenario would be a very decisive Trump win. While he is currently down in the polls, he was also down by a similar margin to Hillary Clinton in 2016. And even if his current 53% disapproval rating seems like an indicator in predicting his loss, both Obama and George Bush Sr. had similar disapproval ratings before winning their second terms in office. It is, therefore, impossible to rule out a decisive Trump victory as a very real scenario heading into the election. So decisive victory for either Biden or Trump is very possible based on recent polling and past history. While the first scenario would make the process swift and on schedule like it's supposed to be, there's been concern recently regarding President Trump's comments on voter fraud that have led to speculation about what the election could look like if the vote count for the presidency is very close in key swing states. Trump said in an interview, quote, "I have to see. Look, I have to see. No, I'm not going to just say yes. I'm not going to say no, and I didn't last time either," end quote. Trump said this in response to a question on whether he will accept the results of the election. The president has stated many concerns about mail-in voting, which tie to his statement about accepting the results. He has said, quote, "Mail-in voting is going to rig the election," end quote. David Brooks from the New York Times has shared his take on what election day could look like if the race is very close. And I feel it could potentially hold a lot of truth based on the president's statements on the election so far. Brooks paints a scenario like this. Trump wins the Electoral College on election day and claims victory. In many states, mail-in ballots must be received by election officials on or before election day to be counted. But in some states, mail-in ballots will be counted if they are postmarked prior to election day and are received by election officials no later than a few days after the election, depending on the state. Polls have shown that a majority of mail-in voters intend to vote Democrat, especially in large cities. So a few days after the election, some states might be flipped depending on whether a sufficient number of mail-in ballots are accepted or disqualified. Will there be recounts due to irregularities in the process? Will the courts have to become involved? Will the in-person vote determine the winner? Or will the mail-in ballots counted days later determine the winner? Nobody can say for sure. These aren't the only scenarios that could possibly happen in the upcoming election, but based off recent news in the weeks leading up to November 3rd and past election analytics, these are definitely possible outcomes we could see unfold. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. And we're going to hear finally from Willem.
Thank you, Ms. Berg. My fellow presenters have made a compelling case for the importance of the democratic process and voting. Whether you're on TikTok or Twitter, celebrities and influencers are all urging you to vote. Why? Because what you have to say matters. Election day is just 26 days away. So let me give you the who, what, where, when, and why of voting in Massachusetts. So first of all, who can vote? All US citizens can vote. Since Congress passed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, federal law has prohibited non-citizens from voting in national elections. Non-citizens who do vote may face fines, imprisonment, and possible deportation. Whether non-citizens should be allowed to vote and how prevalent illegal voting by non-citizens is continues to be the subject of debate. Next, let's talk about what preparation is required before voting. Voting takes 2 steps: registering to vote and casting your ballot. The first step in the process is to register to vote. An important tip to know is that you can automate your registration through the Registry of Motor Vehicles. Many of us at Roxbury Latin, myself included, are too young to vote, but there is something that you can do now to make it easier to vote in the future. Every time you go to the RMV for a driver's license, learner's permit, or identification card, you'll be offered the opportunity to apply for voter registration or update your voter registration information. When you do register, you'll be asked to register as either a Democrat, Republican, or Independent. Choose a political party that has roughly the same general views that you do. The League of Women Voters describes the 2 major parties in the following broad way. The Democratic Party thinks that the government should do more for people, whereas the Republican Party thinks that the government should make it easier for people to do things for themselves. If you do not want to join a political party, you can choose to be an independent. A voter's political party registration will impact which ballot you receive in a presidential primary, but not in the general election. You can change your party affiliation online or by mail with a new voter registration form at any time. You will need to be at least 18 on November 3rd to vote in this presidential election. But if you haven't registered to vote yet, you still have time. The deadline is October 24th. In Massachusetts, the Secretary of State's office handles voter registration. You can register on your phone or computer. Here, let me show you right now just how easy it is. So right now, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to do it on Google, but this will work in any browser. So you're going to open it up, and you're going to begin by just typing in, I'm doing it live, mass.gov vote. And you're going to click this one here that appears to have 2 arrows, topics voting. You're then going to scroll down. You're going to be introduced to this voting in big green. You're going to scroll down a bit. You're going to see right here in this, on the left side at the bottom, register to vote. You're going to click on that. You'll hit register to vote again a second time here at the top. And you're going to hit these are the 3 major questions that I introduced previously. Are you a citizen? Yes. Are you at least 16? Yes. Do you have an ID? Yes. You're then going to be asked to enter some basic personal information, but nothing too complicated. So as of recently, they've made registration really easy, and it shouldn't be an excuse that registration is hard, as because of the pandemic, they've really improved the system. I'd now like to kind of just introduce and show absentee ballot voting and mail-in ballot voting, as I'll be talking about it more in the next part of my speech. But if you go back only 2 pages, you'll see apply for an absentee ballot over here on your right side. You're going to click on that. And if you scroll all the way down, you'll see at the bottom of this is an application for absentee ballot. But what you're going to want, and most people are going to be more interested in, is mail-in ballot voting, which is right here in attention red. You're going to click on that. Submit a vote by mail application. It'll take you to this. You're just going to hit get started. And again, some basic personal information, nothing crazy. So I'm just going to further explain and get into now how that will work, mail-in ballot voting, and also how absentee ballot voting will also work. But as you guys can see, it's very easy, so it shouldn't be an excuse, as it's pretty simple. I think all of us can handle it. So voting by mail is available to all voters for all elections in 2020, and you should submit your application for mail-in ballot voting no later than October 20th. You do not need an excuse to vote by mail this year. So the Secretary of State's office will send you a mail-in ballot vote with a return envelope. You can mail the ballot to the address and even track your ballot through the state's website, which I thought was a cool feature. Mail-in ballots need to be postmarked no later than November 3rd and must be back at your local election office no later than November 6th. If you want to return your ballot in person, however, instead of sending it, there will be dedicated drop boxes available throughout the state, and you will have until 8 p.m. on election day to drop off your ballot. Lastly, if you bring your absentee ballot to your polling location on election day, you will be allowed to vote in person, but your mail-in ballot has to be spoiled first to prevent you from voting twice, which I must say is illegal. A spoiled vote is an election term referring to a vote that is deemed to be invalid and is not included in the vote count. Spoiling your ballot can be done by turning in your ballot without voting for any candidate. So the next question, where exactly do you vote? If you do decide to vote in person, make a plan for election day, including knowing the polling address in your neighborhood. To know for sure where you need to go back to the Secretary of State's website, enter your address, and it will instantly give you your polling site. The essential thing to keep in mind this year, though, is that the pandemic has forced some polling locations to close because they were too small and would not have allowed for people to keep 6 feet apart from one another. When you get to the polling site, you typically don't need to show any ID, except if one of the following applies to you. You're voting for the first time in Massachusetts, your registration status is inactive because you haven't voted it recently, the poll worker has some reasonable suspicion that leads them to request ID, or lastly, that you have to complete a provisional ballot at the polls. A provisional ballot is used when someone is not on the list at the polling site. Provisional ballots are sealed in an envelope and not counted until you're determined eligible. So be sure to take your ID with you if you do have one, just in case anything crazy happens, but normally you would not need one. So what happens when you get there? What does it look like inside? You will typically see poll workers sitting behind long plastic tables. Approach the table when you're next and state your name and address. So after they look up your name and check it off, they will hand you an oversized cardstock or paper ballot and direct you over to some private booths. You mark your ballot with a Sharpie type pen, filling in the bubble for your preferred candidates, a yes or no on ballot question number 1, motor vehicle mechanical data, and ballot question number 2, ranked choice voting, and various other local issues. After you have marked your ballot, you walk over to the tables near the exit, give your name again, and then insert your ballot into the optical scanning machine. Massachusetts, however, still uses paper ballots in a few places where you drop the marked ballot into a sealed ballot box, and after that you will get a sticker with an American flag for your shirt. The next important question is, when can you vote? The short answer is that you can vote practically all day on November 3rd, which is a Tuesday, not a federal holiday as it should be. Polls open at 7 a.m. and close at 8 p.m. Again, it's essential to make a plan for when you will go. Most people vote on the way to or from work or on their lunch breaks, so try to avoid these times if possible, as it will be less busy on other times. If you need to go later, don't worry. As long as you're in line when the polls close, you will be allowed to vote. Even if the law doesn't require it, many businesses do give workers paid time off to vote. If you need a ride to the polls, both Uber and Lyft have special programs running on November 3rd. Both companies are offering free and discounted rides to the polls. Uber is also planning to work with a group called Pizza to the Polls to get free pizza slices delivered to waiting voters. To close, I want to impart this message. When you vote, you are making your voice heard. You are expressing what you need, want, and believe in. All of us at this school have the power to transform this country by casting our ballots when the time comes. Yes, there are ways that some of the steps involved in voting could be made easier. And yes, voting in America can be much more difficult in some states as compared to Massachusetts. It can also be much more difficult for those in lower socioeconomic classes who face multiple barriers to vote. Some of the people in this country, though, are not voting by choice. And that, in my opinion, is unacceptable. When we don't vote, we voluntarily silence ourselves. When we vote, we matter. I don't think there is a person at this school who thinks they don't matter or what they have to say doesn't matter. So go vote. Thank you.